All right, well, welcome everyone. Queen City Flutter, we meet on the third Wednesday of every month. We start at 6. We don't usually ever go until 8, probably an hour and a half, but it really depends on how everything goes. Um, we used to meet in person here in Charlotte. So, like we said earlier, uh, QC Flutter is for the Queen City, Queen Charlotte. Um, and Yeah, looking to meet back in person again, but it's been great having people tune in from everywhere. And so tonight, um, just a few things if we wanted to like kick it off with kind of a discussion. Um, but um, so on a personal note, the company I work for, we're in the trade show business. And so, as you can imagine, right now is not a great time to be in the trade show business. So I'm in the process of moving into software development full time, and my background is kind of in Ruby on Rails development. But I'm also considering, hey, look, I mean, Flutter, getting into Flutter now, learning everything early can really you know be of value down the road as this technology grows, and uh, the more user friendly it gets and the more robust it becomes. So um, it's interesting though, even just a year ago, because I've been looking, just kind of give you some um, background on some of the things I've looked up. But um, there's even a website now called flutterjobs.com, and they have tons and tons of jobs. And even a year ago when I looked, there were a good amount, but not that many. But now there's like way more, which is a great sign that you know um, Flutter developers are starting to become more and more um, needed. So, anyways, this would be my first job, working professionally in development. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it. In the meantime, um, speaking of Charlotte and everything, I I do have a side project that I've kind of always played with called Charlotte Lunch Randomizer. It's kind of it's actually a website. It's a really terrible front end, but so basically you can go on and you can click it and it'll give you a random lunch to go to, because sometimes you can't decide, where you want to go to lunch, and you can just click that and it'll give you a random lunch. So, I built it in Ruby on Rails, and now I'm like, hey, whenever I'm learning a new language, it's fun to build this. So I'm going to build it out in Flutter, Firebase, backend, and I'm also going to make it all open source. So anybody that wants to, tinker with it or look at it, um, can, feel free to do so. And if there's anybody else out there like learning, if you wanted to kind of like build, work on things together, always feel free to send me a message. But um, that's kind of a few things on my end. I just wanted to throw out there. But yeah, anybody have any like somebody looking for a Flutter developer job? Any good resources or tips or?
Yeah, I think at the start, Flutter jobs as well as Slack community are some of the best ways to at least get things started. And for those that are just getting started in Flutter, we do have a YouTube channel, and we have some content that goes from basic to intermediate to advanced. And if you've not heard of the app breweries, they had a Flutter boot camp. That I think is a really good tool to, especially if you're getting very early in and you want some guided lectures and content. I think that's a really good way to get started.
Perfect. Yeah,
Yeah.
I just wrote that down. So, thanks.
Sure.
Does anybody else here tonight work in Flutter full time, or just
Maybe question mark. And certainly when I'm presenting here pretty soon, it'll be helpful. I'll try and tailor this to the audience. So if you want, you can list it in the chat, or otherwise I can just start with the basics and we can kind of work our way from there as a dialogue. But okay.
Very cool.
So, Carl, do you mind if I take it away?
Yep.
Okay.
Take it away.
All right. I'm going to
Thanks
share.
again for doing this.
Yeah, of course. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully, let me see. Let me know if you see my screen. Maybe?
Yep.
Cool. So to answer part of that question, my day job is not primarily as a Flutter developer, but I have been doing some aspect of Flutter development, or at least teaching it since January of 2019, for whatever that's been worth. Today, as I mentioned, I do want this to be a bit of a dialogue. So if there are questions, and we can certainly guide this in a number of different directions, but I'm an MD, I'm a physician by trade, and I will be covering some of the cool stuff that you can do with Flutter, specifically in healthcare. And there's some duality of my role. On one side, specifically within Meijun, I am a Flutter developer, entrepreneur, and YouTuber, whatever that means. And I'll link that YouTube channel in chat. And then on the other side, I am a emergency medicine physician, informatician, and an educator. So I teach medical students and residents in the hospital on shift. And most of the stuff I'm going to do today is on that left side, but with a healthcare spin. So there's a bit of a theme for many of the things that are related to these various roles. I have a startup called Meijun. We have a Twitter handle called Dr. June. The YouTube channel is Flutter June, and my GitHub account is FHIR June. And some of the stuff I'm presenting today is also available on that GitHub. I am talking about something called FHIR, but it's a little bit different than FHIR. But the term FHIR June actually came from the fact that I have a very weird hobby, and I've done this for, 10 to 15 years now. I think getting closer to 15 at this point. So that is where that title lies. But one of the real excellent benefits of Flutter in particular is that the way that you can develop within Flutter, you say what you want, you declare it, and then it just works. And that is in large part because of the way that they have their widget structure set up. And the fact that I give the analogy of like driving a car, you don't necessarily have to know all of the intricacies of your spark plugs and your piston engines, etc., to be able to drive. You just turn the wheel and let it go. And one of the barriers to entry, especially with app development, is absolutely reduced with Flutter as a whole, because you can go down and down and down into all of the various languages that are a part of it within the Dart code, and to even down to stateless and stateful widgets and further and further. But really, if you were just starting out, start with the basics of the various widgets and then work from there. And some of the stuff I'm going to cover called FHIR builds upon that same concept. And I really think that those two integrate really well. So this is a Flutter event. This is a Flutter conference. It's a Flutter Meetup, rather. Google's open source toolkit is Flutter. Its last I saw had about 500,000 monthly developers, had at least 10,000 apps on the Google Play Store, and had 15,000 packages available on pub.dev. And even though Dart has been around for, I think, closer to about 8+ years, and Flutter was only released in December of 2018, in all of 2019, it propelled Dart into the fastest growing language on GitHub. And for very, very, very good reason. I'm going to provide these slides in the chat. If you're interested, you're welcome to look through. But with the Fun with Flutter channel has a really good 4-minute, that's all you need, at least to learn to get things started from the very basics. And then on my channel, I have a 2-hour very basic course and then a 2-hour intermediate one. This was actually given for physicians who also wanted continuing medical education. And this was given for University of Texas Austin's graduate school course in AI health. But today we're going to talk a little bit about FHIR-FLI, and it's also convenient that Gray is here on the call because a large part of this builds directly upon the excellent work that Gray has done. And I'll explain what FHIR is, but the short version of that is it is the standard for healthcare interoperability. And so we took that standard and then we put it together with Flutter library integration. And we essentially have a quick 90-second and some basic educational segments that kind of cover some of the stuff that we've done, also open source. But I think it's really probably worth just going into some of this code and showing you exactly what all this stuff is. So since I have this chat open, I'm going to put into the chat my channel as well as those slides that we just had as 2 separate links. And let's go ahead and get started. So the healthcare spin of what we're looking at today comes from an international organization. It's been around. FHIR has been around since 2011. That's when they first started drafting it. But it essentially stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. It is a standard specification through which all health data are and can be represented. And it is a global thing, and for very good reason. And if people are interested, I can go into some of the final rules and things within our own legislation that say, this is your standard, we're using it. Because it is so large, there are multiple specifications on it. Right now we're on version 4. And it's not just, the patient, it's the healthcare practitioners, it's the organization, it's your allergies, it's your problem lists, the medications that you're on, billing things. It gets really, 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 really detailed as you go into depth. And what we have done, and these are available on pub.dev, if you just search for FHIR, FHIR, you can find the various packages that Gray has published and continues to update. Right now, there's 5 of them. The largest one is this one called FHIR, FHIR. And that takes any of the currently active and even the preview version of this. And literally all it does is it is a serialization and deserialization method for all of those intricate data elements that make up the FHIR specification. Put this differently. You have a patient and you have a lot of named class objects that define many of the various things within a patient. So birth date, name, identifiers, things like that. Or as another example, you have an observation, which, blood pressure or specific vital sign elements, or conditions, so like a problem or a diagnosis or things like that. And these are all, they all follow this basic hierarchy of an object-oriented language that allows you from the opposite side to just pick the version, is it R4 or STU3, and pick the concept and then work with that, which is extremely powerful. So part of FHIR-FLI is to do this, and part of FHIR-FLI is to actually show how this is done specifically within Flutter using the wonderful elements that are inherent to Flutter. And to give you a good example, we, as part of a project that started in early October, we took a scientifically derived questionnaire that has already been out and well validated and exists as a resource within FHIR, and turned it into an app. And so here's the app. And so if you look at the questionnaire itself, there are 21 questions, that are related to social determinants of health, because that's specifically what it addresses. And what we do on our side is we take that data from its FHIR specification, convert it through the FHIR packages that I've mentioned, display it dynamically. So if you had updated the FHIR resources, we could actually change the way the questions are ordered, or, this one was a Boolean, this was a, radio button, whereas this one contains various checkboxes. And some of them even have additional values that appear if you are, they only appear if you check them. But we essentially give you that ability to answer or display any of these FHIR resources dynamically, which is pretty powerful. All of this is available on GitHub. Specifically, this one is FHIR-Prapare. And we show you the architecture that this follows, as well as the folder structure. And we've also been working on some various videos that teach from the very basics. This is the complex version of that. But even from the very basics, how you can use that same architecture in your Flutter project. And I'll be happy to go in depth on any of those aspects of that. But certainly we can go from there. So I'm just going to show you this part for those who are interested. The FHIR specification essentially has, a key value JSON resource. And we like that, but we realize that it's kind of a pain to edit this stuff by hand, because if you miss one comma, you've ruined the whole JSON file. So one of the 5 packages that we also have is the conversion to and from JSON to YAML and vice versa. Because we found, given all the wonderful things that are a part of Flutter specifically, YAML is really easy to look at and much easier to interpret. Does this all make sense so far as I'm filling out this questionnaire? Maybe? No? Sure? Cool. Okay.
Yeah, could you, oh, John, I had a question. Yeah. Could you maybe show us some of the, widgets for, clicking the button, having something appear?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll show you that. Let me get back to the original, because I think this one is the easiest one to show. So within our UI, we have the home view, and I'm just going to close this part so you can see it. And this one page is a scaffold, which has an app bar, which is at the very top, and essentially no height. And then the styled scroll on overflow is what allows me to, if this is too small, scroll up and down so that I can actually display this a little bit more cleanly as you have, let's say if you have this on a smaller phone size, you'll be able to scroll up and down. Clearly that part isn't optimized for a landscape layout, but definitely you can go from there. And then our app logo, I can command click into this here just to show you what that actually is. But we essentially have them as a styled component that is just an image asset that decides if we want this to be light mode versus dark mode. So if I switch this to dark mode, the app logo, it will load a different logo to match our color scheme. And, I can go into depth on this too, but we also have this available in 26 different languages. And as you change these things dynamically within the app, you will see that update in real time. And if you use one of the locales that's left to right aligned versus right to left aligned, it will actually update all of those various elements in your app too. So for those just getting started in Flutter, one of the really, really cool and dynamic things that you can do with this is while the app is running, you can just, if I wanted to make another logo, I'd just do that and press save, and you're going to see another logo appear here. And if I wanted to move this a little further down inside my scroll here, I can just move it down. I am using, if you command click into this, because everything that says styled at the start actually is themed a specific way so that it would be consistent throughout the app's architecture. And so if you go to dialed scroll on overflow, this part. So everything inside of that is a list of widgets, which is shown here. But if you actually click on that, what it takes is the various list of children. So this is a list of widgets. And what it builds is a single child scroll view with some padding and a column. That's all this is. And so if you're starting from flutter.dev at the very, very basics, and I will bring this up. So if you go to flutter.dev's website and you go to docs over here, and you say widgets catalog, this is the absolute first step that you should go through as you're looking through some of these parts. And when you're going to, I mentioned app bar, you can actually see the app bar a little bit better on this part. This whole thing is the app bar. And yes, it does get smaller and larger as you scroll up and down, but it's still an app bar. The column I mentioned on that prior page, but this is a column too. Containers are kind of convenience widgets that let you get things positioned, etc. Rows and columns are very, very similar. The only difference is where your main axis is. And a scaffold is essentially the thing that you consider that is a just a general page. And so scaffold, as an example, as you go into a little bit more depth, it will tell you all of the variations that you have. So where's my scaffold? So I don't know if you can read this, but app bar is this thing at the very top. Bottom app bar would be something that's shown here at the bottom. A floating action button, which you'll see whenever I fill out this survey. If you have something on the left side, that's one of the navigation drawers. Usually it's on the left, but if you want to, you can move it over to the other side. A bottom sheet, when we press submit, you'll be able to see a bottom sheet that appears. So this one application has many of the elements that are essential to the basics of Flutter development. But keep in mind that just like I had showed with here, I'm showing you a very complex app. And if you are early on in working with a Flutter application, start with the basics. You watch the 2-hour videos that I've got, or you could watch the first part of the Get Fluttered series, or you could do the boot camp from the App Brewery, or there's a number of resources that are available as you're getting started with Flutter. Does that all make sense? Maybe? Question mark? Yes? Cool? Okay. I'm going to keep clicking through this, and I can answer other questions as we go. And I'm just going to click it randomly. Any other questions or thoughts that people want me to cover, at least right now?
Yeah, hi. No, this is Ashen here. So I'm as looking into the design, I am seeing like this almost follows like Google's material design, but it's possible to like switch to the iOS kind of feel without much of the effort, or do we have to style both the apps like Android and iPhone separately?
Previous and next, I believe, are bottom app bar. It's been a while since I made that. And to answer the other question, you can make this look like whatever you want. The benefit of Flutter in particular is that it is really a pixel perfect design. And so when you think about one of the things that made Flutter so unique whenever it was released in December of 2018, one of them was hot reload. So you just press save and it updates in real time. And one of them is, unlike many other of the cross-platform tools that were available at that time, this one handles all of the UI drawing, period. And so that was one of the reasons why it could get 60 frames a second. But if you want this to look like a Cupertino specific widget, you just go to the Cupertino specific widget and you put in a Cupertino action sheet or alert dialog or date picker or any of that. It is that simple. And if you wanted to hot swap one of those to the other, assuming that the named named parameters that are inside of your widget tree. So giving a good example, if I used column and I decided I wanted to switch it to row, I just change that, and that's all I have to change. One final element in terms of design, and I'll just show you this part. Our design came through inspiration directly from Prapare's implementation toolkit, which is available on their website. A lot of the color schemes and things like that also came from inspiration here. Even those icons for personal characteristics, things like that, they all come from that. And so we started with the wireframes here that we drew out based on inspiration from what they had available, and then drew the layouts, including, you know, that part where you scroll up and down, and then we built it. And with the exception that we had heard feedback to add this and to make this white instead of having that light green background for your, you know, just for your text, I think it turned out pretty close. Now looking at this in retrospect, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Hopefully this is, for those who have never heard of Flutter or are early into this can serve as a bit of inspiration. But this was, I mean, we're pretty proud of this app. It took us a while. It was a lot of effort. But compared to doing this natively in Android and iOS, to have done the majority of this tech UI within about 10 weeks is impressive, I think. I'm biased. But that is really, I think that speaks to the power of Flutter as a technical toolkit for those that are interested in Android, iOS, web, etc. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, so I'm going to show the next part, which is whenever you're done with all of these questions, and technically you can answer optional questions too. And I think I had mentioned, but I'll just show you that as I change this to a different language, it updates all of the questions in that relevant language. But everything that is stored, all of the data that are stored as coded FHIR resources. What appears here is a floating action button that allows us to press submit. And there are a few options that we have here. And so I've shown you some of the front end. I've shown you some of the code that we used to create that front end. And now I'm going to show you some of the back end that we built. FHIR, FHIR, is available as, there's a number of servers that you can use. There's public servers that you can use, as well as private servers. And we're going to show one of either. If I wanted to display this locally, just so that you see it, you heard me talk about FHIR as a bundle, or FHIR as a resource available in YAML. This is essentially what you would get. And clearly, you're not going to show this to your end user, but I think it's helpful to just to know how these data are being stored on the back end, so that they can connect interoperably with any health resource that can accept it. Does that make sense? Maybe? Question mark. Cool. Yes. Awesome. So then we have two servers that we have this connected to right now, that we've connected this to a number before. And this is going to want me to sign in, so I'm just going to bring that down quickly and just click through it. And then show you what all of that looks like. And go. Okay, so now it says it was in process and successfully uploaded to Michigan's Health Information Network. And what that does, in part of this questionnaire, we have one that gives insecurity for food, because you answer, or in this, I answer the question, do I have food insecurity? And the answer, we said yes. And then we also have all of the various resources that are there. And if we went to the website from Michigan's Health Information Network, and we search through their questionnaire responses, and we just go to the end of the pages. Here we go. And I will just click on this last one. At this time period, in UTC, and this is the questionnaire that we just filled out, stored in a manner that is interoperable. This also will, thanks to some of the work that Gray has also set up, this will allow you to, 2333, make 2 additional conditions where, it asked, do you have a concern about finding your home? Or do you have a concern about food insecurity? There they are. And so it has taken our Flutter data displayed through FHIR, connected to a FHIR server, and then published this in a way that can be used interoperably. Questions on that part? Maybe? Question mark? No. Cool. Okay. We can do the same thing with a public server. It looks essentially the same. I am happy to go over that, but they're both technically happy servers. This is a Flutter discussion. I figured it would be fun to do a little bit more live coding and actually showing some of the Flutter code. There are a couple of things I'm happy to cover if there's interest, and at some point I'm planning to do a video specifically on this. But the way that we are storing our strings is using a Google spreadsheet that allows us to use that spreadsheet to connect to the various 26 different languages that we have here. And we're using a package called, I think it's Google Sheets. Where's it at? Flutter Sheet Localization. That allows us to create a generated file that connects to that document directly and gives us all of the sheets in the language that is useful, so that way you now have locale. Well, you have multiple locales for your single Flutter app. I think that's pretty cool. I really love the Flutter Sheet localization, specifically because this is stored directly on the Flutter app. It does not have to go to the cloud and find your spreadsheet to update those things. It's code generated. Yeah. So essentially what we do is we update the ID, the sheet ID, and we run Flutter pub runner build, and it will, and I delete this .g file, and it will essentially go to this website and download and all of the various language translations that you have, and then put that directly into the app. Another thing, I think the proper way to do these, especially if there's questions, is to have somebody who is a native speaker for in each of the various languages to look at them and make sure that they make sense. But if you're not to that point quite yet, one option that you can do is just equals Google Translate. And that's all we did at the start, especially for the very simple questions like choose language, choose theme, etc. And that was another, I think, pretty useful trick that we had so that we could very quickly get a lot of localizations very quickly. Does that make sense? Okay. Because we're doing that and we're using them as labels, another thing that we're able to do, and I'm going to just go into our UI, and inside, I'm looking specifically for this question. So that's within my survey. And I'm looking at this answer, which takes a string. And this one specifically is the part that generates all of this here. So it's got some padding. Actually, that one isn't here. So essentially what I'm doing here is I have this part, which is, this is essentially a text editing controller that I'm using straight out of the box from Flutter. And I've created the ability to build something that is leading if I wanted to, or trailing. And right now I'm going to implement something that is trailing. And instead of this just being an empty container, I'm going to change this to a custom refresh widget, which takes context. And that's literally this part right here. And if I press save, I should get a little refresh button right here, which has a column and says set your language. And then it's got a little refresh icon. And let's hope this actually works. I hope it does. We'll see. Good question. I think right now, and we'll test it when we switch our language, trailing on a left to right language locale will be shown on the right, and trailing on the right to left locale should be shown on the left. But we'll find out for sure if my app will update, because I'm also recording and running lots of things at once. I hope it works. Other questions? Come on, button. Okay, update. So if I switch this, let me switch the language to Spanish, and then just click away. And then if I click this button, it says Espanol. Okay, good. And now let's check Arabic, because that's a right to left, and it's on the left side, and it updates as we would expect. So that is the answer to your question. And that part, I didn't hard code into this. I am purely using widgets. This is a row widget, and I just have this where leading is first, this is second, and trailing is last. And Flutter is doing a lot of that work for me. Other thoughts, other questions?
So I guess you have so on the on pressed, I was just looking at your code right here. On the on press, you have the controller object value like set basically to that language title,
correct.
or I guess how does okay.
Yeah, so if you look, and this is one of the benefits of, again, I think sometimes it's easier to start with, when you see, there needs to be a duality of the code that you're reviewing. There makes a lot of sense to see something as built from the very basics and something as complex that you can use for inspiration. And the very basics part is get fluttered, and this is the inspiration part. Hopefully, if you like our architecture. If you don't like it, then use whatever you want, of course. And our architecture follows Git, following an MVC+S pattern. And so this controller this is where it kind of gets weird, because it's called controller, but it is a GetxController, which we have it where it finds it right here. But if I command click onto here, the two things that you need are text editing controller. This is why I'm annoyed by the duality. Like, these are the same words, but they're not the same object. And then this is a RX string, which is a stream available within Git. And so I'm just going to command click onto here and onto here. So answer item decimal or string controller. Everything that accepts a string like this, or a decimal, like one of the questions in this was, how many people do you live with? Those values are all, they all use this same GetxController format locally with their own unique tags, so you don't mess up one of the other controllers' text. And when you're creating when you're using something that allows you to edit any text here, you will use a text editing controller. And the common path is to do this within set state whenever the change is updated, but we're using Git instead of set state. And we're using streams so that the UI just automatically updates, just because we found that was a lot easier. But whenever you are clicking this button, what it does is it goes back into this specific controller file that is unique to this and only this one. understanding that there's different ones throughout the survey. And it will change the value of text editing controller, and it will update the locally stored object. So those are the only two things that are updated whenever you push this button. Does that make sense? Maybe, sure. I'm going very heavily into the weeds here, but I hope it's...
Gotcha. So basically, it's getting saved like real time every time you make a change.
Absolutely. This is what you
nice.
This is what you see is the text editing controller, like with the this part right here where you have the blinking cursor, etc. And then you also have a locally stored variable that after debouncing will update our own data model. And so here's a good example. If I press delete a bunch of times, it goes away because the validation is gone. But if I press a button, it updates. And we have a thing set up so you can debounce this so you're not updating over and over and over again. So we actually have, and I can show you within our command, we have a, I think it's an update response, debounce, and save response command, which essentially works with all of those string values. And I have it set to 400 milliseconds, so it waits a certain time period before it tries to do any validation. But if I just start typing, it's not going to update until I stop typing. So if I set this to like 2000 milliseconds, oops, so 2 seconds, you probably will see it a little bit more. Hot reload, come on. Thank you, Flutter. But this will work for as I'm making those changes. So if I press this, it should just wait a little bit before it actually updates. And then the other thing that this works on are, this question is a good example. If I say I live with 11 people, it's going to update it. But if I just start adding decimal places or things that don't work, it waits until I finished making my changes, and then it will validate. So that's another of the really cool things that you can do with, specifically with streams, and done in a way so that you're not saving your resource over and over and over again. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, of course. There's another cool thing that you can do with the text editing controller while we're on the same topic, which I'm going to go back down. And if people are interested, just let me know, and I will make specific videos that address each of these things as time allows for me. But here is a good example. Let's see, currency, it's this one, and specifically this part. But I have something, let's see if I can find it. And it uses the actual symbol. But essentially, as I'm putting in a number for $income, it will add a comma to the number that's there. Which is really, really useful. But what's stored on the back end, and it still does the same debounce before it validates, but what's stored on the back end is this exact number without comma values so that you can work across locales, which is really, really cool. And yes, I agree. There are always optimizations for naming, but the specific thing with controllers is reflective of the commonality of text editing controllers and things like that. That is unique to Flutter. And we picked a package called Git, which uses its own version of controller to store values instead of set state and update. One question is why unique use widgets versus instance properties to change the behavior? Can you define that a little bit more?
Sure, this is Richard Haven. So you seem to be making multiple widgets that are variations on an ancestor, but the variations look pretty small.
Mhm.
And you said you did that to avoid having one widget affect another. But
Okay.
if the widgets are separate instances, if they had properties that controlled their behavior, each instance would have the properties it was generated with, and they wouldn't interfere with each other anyway.
Yeah. So I think I'll give 2 examples of this and tell me if this answers your question, Richard. I think I know what you're trying to say, or maybe I'm mistaking it. A lot of what I'm showing you here are often something that extends a stateless widget, like any of those answer choices. This is an answer choice. This is one. This is an answer choice, but it's not defined in the FHIR specification, and we're specifically bringing that out so that it can be a Boolean instead of either a checkbox or a radio button. And so that we were able to do, a lot of these are essentially very, very, very similar. We ended up using an abstract class for every answer item, where if it has an enable when option, the thing that I kind of mentioned where you click other and then it just appears, it'll display that. Otherwise, it won't. And so that way, if it looks like a checkbox or if it looks like a Boolean or any of those other things, they all extend from the same, or they all implement the same abstract class. And that was purely to eliminate redundant code, so that if we made one change, it would do that as little as possible. Because
I understand.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm talking
okay.
about the things you were describing a little bit earlier, where you said like the formatting of the classes. I mean, you have a deep hierarchy. You have now right now on the screen, you have a bunch of different Boolean ones. Are those just different behaviors, or are those for individual questions?
Yeah. So so each question is loaded specifically based on which type it is. So like a radio button, any one of these, I'm running this once.
Okay.
Question item radio button, which has its own associated GetxController for this one and just this one. But if I made changes to this, it's going to update this one, this, and all of the radio button question items throughout the entire survey. So
good. I think I'm talking about the controllers.
Yes.
So
okay.
I understand there's a separate instance of the controller for each thing. Is there a separate class?
Well, so if it's a text editing controller, it's a separate instance for each version. And if you don't do that, and the nice thing is whenever I'm closing these, they get closed dynamically, by the way. As I switch from one page to the next, if it's not being used, it's getting closed to save your memory. And you can see this in the debug console. But if I had this as the only text editing controller, and then I update to a different one, unless I have them uniquely tagged, and I make changes here, it's going to update this one too. So I have to use unique tags and unique instances of that class, even though that text editing controller, I mean, it's going to be the same, be it a string input or a decimal input. The only variation on the backend or on the GetxController side is, those parts are exactly the same. Just what is it connected to? Is it connected to something that validates for decimals or integers or string? Does that make sense?
Okay. I just thought you were saying that you had a different controller class for every question.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It is what you see as a very nested hierarchy was our. It was a big endeavor to take a survey that is 21 questions, and to display it with as little redundancy of code as possible, with flexibility of FHIR data. And so what you see are essentially the variations of what types of questions they could be. So this is probably a good example. If it takes a checkbox or a text or things along those lines, it will decide based on that and then display the widget that gives you this. So the default for most questions is not a stateful, there's not something that requires a state to keep track of what's been done. But these need it so that we know which one is actually selected. And so, yeah.
I built this kind of dynamic UI system. I understand the challenges.
Absolutely.
It is very impressive.
Thanks. I appreciate it. And this stuff is available on GitHub. If any are interested, we're happy to share this code, as well as the way that we have this connected to FHIR. Because really, you know, as more things are becoming available within Flutter specifically, we think that this is a nice, you know, you can argue as much as you want in terms of which state to utilize. This was the easiest balance that we had of control and power with ease of entry and a lower barrier to entry. And so we started with something very simple that follows this MVC+S architecture. And this is our very complex example of the MVC+S architecture, but they do the same thing. And so everything that's in your UI, be it nested or not, if it's connecting, it may connect directly with a controller, either one that's kind of more broad for the entire application or one that's specific to that UI, like a view controller. But for most of the global functions, like login, log out, submit this button, debounce, it's a command which will usually harness a controller or directly call a service. And we allow, rather than letting your view directly call a service, even if it's something as simple as, here's a good example, here, where we're talking about the Prapare survey or the work that we did, or the stuff about FHIR-FLI or the various open source packages that we used, including our icons, etc. If you wanted to just click on this and see where the code is available, that would call the service of URL launcher. And we wanted to keep this side of our application as far away from this side as possible, so that you really have that single responsibility principle. And then all your data and the models that shape it are there. And this was it was a big endeavor to work with FHIR data specifically for this questionnaire resource. But I think we did it in a pretty good way that allows these things to be to translate no matter what FHIR questionnaire you're using. And to make it truly interoperable as a questionnaire, we certainly have a little bit of extra work in terms of updating, when you go from this page to the other. But what we have already, I think, is something that can show and can be harnessed with other FHIR resources and other things that aren't related to healthcare specifically. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Other questions? I'm happy to answer them or show other things. No, maybe. Okay. Do you want me to kind of cover a little bit of the architecture? Do you think that would be helpful? Since I think that would hit both, I think that would hit or answer some of the things that are in depth as well as basic specifically to here. I'm happy to cover that if you think that's good, or we can end it early. It's up to you all. Maybe? Question mark? Silence?
Yeah, if you want to dig into that.
Okay, yeah, sure.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so I do have a video that also showed this for whatever that's worth, but I'll just kind of cover it, and this will be a bit of QA. And also, if there are suggestions, certainly they are welcome, as we built this. Everything internal with that underscore at the start are just your utility classes and the things that pretty much won't change as well as the custom modifications that we have on things that are existing within Flutter. And the really good example of a custom component is when we were building this and we wanted this to get to follow that layout that I showed in the wireframe so that this would get smaller and larger. The tab height here was too small. And everything else about a tab was perfect. We didn't need to change anything else, but the tab height was just too small. And so we took Flutter's custom, or the Flutter's tab directly, copied it over, added a little custom underscore to the start, and then set our own custom tab height because there is no named parameter that you can pass to tab in its current form. And we expect that whenever this gets utilized down the road, then we'll end up just deleting this one file and pointing it directly over to tabs, and that's it. So that's usually the point of components. They're almost always custom, and where we actually call this, we also are using. Do custom. This will let me type. We actually call this as custom.tab so that there's no confusion of what we're using it and why. That's really what we're doing with this part. The constants that are mostly here are the JSON and YAML representations of our Prapare survey, things that won't update. And constants and enums should be, at least in your mind, about the same thing. And the item types, whether it accepts a decimal or integer or things like that. Right now, we're not using all of the item types that are available yet. We essentially have those all together. And then any of the utility classes, so for like validation or specifically checking, because all of these FHIR data are coded resources here. So the things that work with a lot of those codes to help us translate and say, well, this code doesn't change at all. It's always the same, no matter which question. Those are done within our utility class. API, we have public and private APIs, and the private ones we have ignored, clearly. And the public one, the only public one we're using is essentially this translation, because it's run once in it occasionally, and it's really just to make things easier. Controllers are almost exclusively where we have our GetxControllers. For those that have seen anything that is related to Git, Git is where we store state. That is how we store state, rather than using stateful widget. And on one of the videos that I have, I mention, if you're building a stream, or if you're building something that is a regular variable, like string or int or bool, if you're using a regular variable and you update that variable, you need to call an update or know when that you're actually going to trigger a redraw of the UI. Whereas if you're using a stream, there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. And frequently we'll have something that says RX in front of it so that we know it's a string. But we found that was a little bit cumbersome as we started getting more and more in depth with our own data architecture. So we kept that as an optional. So this frequently at the start, we would say RX language just so that we knew. But we found that was it was too much. So we went backwards. And then the commands I had mentioned will call a lot of the various services or things along those lines. And we are, with the exception of launching URLs right now, we're all using an abstract command for the controllers that we know are already being called throughout the application, so that when you get into a specific command, and I've already showed you debounce, I can just find the right controller. Here's a good example. Here, questionnaire controller. It just calls it because I'm using the abstract command feature. So I already have it within the various I have the correct controller called within a command, so that I don't have to worry about managing all of those things by hand. Data models and classes. This is where a large part of our serialization and deserialization of the FHIR questionnaire is used and is performed. And to just give you the very, very, very short version, let me just show a single one. You have something that has a link, which is those codes that I showed you, and then like what it's called. Or, the specific answer item, it could be a Boolean or it could be something along those lines. This is essentially how we're formatting our structure. Routes were interesting because they allowed you to do custom translation or transitions, or to set up data binding. So a good example of data binding is you have a group and you need this to call multiple controllers. And whenever this page is open, because this is all one page, when I go across all of these, this is all one page still. When I hit close, I'm going to discard my changes, that page is gone and the controllers have all been closed to save, space and memory, etc. But, opening the questionnaire and validation and your responses all need to happen whenever you first open this application. And so whenever that occurs, it's going to reinitialize those controllers. And that's all done thanks to data binding. And so I think that was pretty helpful in terms of our various routes. Services are how you can have this connect to the outside world, be it as an HTTP call or a various server, or store your data locally. And I did show at least a good amount, I think, of the styled components, which are the things that go across themes, and the views, which may have their own data binding and controllers. And then all that remains are icon strings and themes. And at one point, I plan to cover these in a little bit more detail. And yes, some of our, we have a checked and an inactive checked and active. And we have probably more icons than we need, even though they're just SVGs. But every time you're using anything in the assets folder, be it as an SVG or a PNG, we have them all in one place. And our entire theme for light mode and dark mode is all in one place, including font selection and font size and things along those lines. And the final point of here is our strings. And if you are not planning to create an app that crosses multiple locales and languages in the way that we did for localization, I would suggest putting all of your app's strings and all of the text that are within your app in one file, and just do s dot and then whatever the string's name is. And that way, if you need to update this, or you decide that you want to scale your app so now it actually uses translations, this is a good way to do that. When did I find that I had to aggressively close controllers? I don't manage controllers at all. Git does that for me. And the times that it opens it are specific to the class that is utilizing it. And there's some times where it can be a little bit, you have to pay attention to when you're calling the controller. But one good example is each of these, as I mentioned, sometimes they have their own controller specifically for these radio buttons. And if it goes from one page to the next, it just closes it on its own. Whereas this entire survey uses some of these larger, where's the not within commands, these controllers for the questionnaire. The questionnaire data, saving our progress, what did you say, and are your data valid? Those are the four controllers that are called on this group. There is one fifth one, which is which one is active, and those are all of the controllers that appear whenever we open this one scaffold and page. If I close it, it will close automatically. If I open it, it will reopen them. And I have them set up so that as a questionnaire, it's going to find all the stuff it needs to so it can load your questionnaire whenever that happens. So I really don't manage it at all. But if you're creating a controller right here in this one page, in this one part of this page, and then you go here and you weren't putting this higher up in the hierarchy, then you have to be careful, because if this closes your controller and this can't load it, you're going to break part of your app. So if you need something that crosses multiple pages, validation being a good example, put it higher up in your widget tree. And that should make it so that it's easier to manage and so that you don't have to manage a lot of that by hand. That make sense? Maybe? No? Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Other questions? I know we've kind of jumped in between beginner, intermediate, and advanced throughout this whole lecture, so sorry, but it's what we did.
Yeah, this is perfect. I could sit here and listen to you all night.
Thanks.
So, soaking it all in.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was really well done.
Thank you. Well, I guess if I don't have any other questions on this part, perhaps we'll call it early.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. Thanks again for doing this today. And if anybody else that's still on, if you know anybody, or if you wanted to share something that you're working on, feel free to send me a message on Meetup. Happy to get you on the schedule as well. I'm also thinking about potentially doing a kind of like a bring your questions session. That way, one of the things I really enjoyed about the in-person meetings was being able to kind of group out, get into smaller groups, and kind of work through some of the issues that you may be having. So I was thinking that may be something we could try here.
Yeah.
You could share your screen, and happy to take a look at it. Also, if you want to send me a message on Meetup, I can share the link to our Slack channel. We have a Flutter channel in the Charlotte Devs Slack, where we, John and Ryan and Mark, others also post new things coming out. But that's all I have.
Yeah.
We appreciate everybody coming in tonight.
Yeah, and keep in mind the stuff we've done at this point. We've had show your apps. We've had some of the basic to advanced things. We've had some people that just showed things that were up on the App Store that they created and that had done some of the wireframes into a Flutter application. So really, if you're interested in Flutter, use it. And we are happy to support no matter where you are in learning about it. So.
Absolutely. Well, sounds good.
Cool.
Well, I enjoyed it, and I will look forward to seeing you guys next month.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.